News channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. Are we in the midst of a financial collapse? The cost of borrowing has rocketed, with UK 30-year gilts at a 20-year high. In America, a 16-year high, and in Germany, a 12-year high. This has dramatically increased the cost of government debt, which makes it harder to fund future spending. Now more than ever, we must grow our economy to solve our economic woes. And what is the point of having a Conservative government when our unelected institutions force us to pursue their own agenda? While the Prime Minister lifted eco-housing regulations that would have incurred charges for homeowners and renters, mortgage providers are continuing with their own net zero targets following orders from the financial regulators. And who else could it be that's in the forefront but partially taxpayer-owned NatWest is once again in the firing line? The nanny state is here to stay, so it seems. Yesterday we covered the Prime Minister's new anti-smoking laws, but today it's been revealed GPs are set to begin screening patients for gambling addictions, as well as smoking and drinking habits. Is this a necessary precaution in an increasingly anxious Britain, or simply the latest chapter in the meddling nanny state? Plus, some great vindicating news for us carnivores. A new study has speculated that many of us are genetically predisposed to need meat in our diets, in a blow to the vegetarian lobby. I'll be having my diet, mostly consisting of meat and dairy, examined by restaurateur and consultant chef Tonya Buxton. State of the Nation starts now. I'll be joined by a refreshing panel this evening, Associate Comment Editor at the Daily Telegraph, Mutaz Ahmed, and the Transcaucasia expert and former Labour MP, Stephen Pound. As always, as you know, I want to hear from you. It's the most important part excuse me, of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's time news of the day with Polly Middlehurst.
Bless you, Jacob. Good evening. Now, the headlines tonight. A man who broke into Windsor Castle armed with a loaded crossbow with the intention of killing the late Queen has been sentenced to 9 years in jail for the crime of treason. Jaswant Singh Chail wandered around inside the grounds of Windsor Castle for 2 hours on Christmas Day 2021 while the late Queen was there. The Old Bailey heard today he'd been encouraged by an artificial intelligence virtual girlfriend with which he'd exchanged thousands of messages. The judge said Chail was non-psychotic and therefore culpable when he devised the plot, but had lost touch with reality and became psychotic by the time he carried it out. In other news today, Sir Keir Starmer has revealed an extra 700,000 urgent dental appointments would be introduced under a Labour government in plans to improve the nation's oral health. The party, they say, would also introduce supervised toothbrushing in schools across England in order to tackle preventable tooth decay in children. People in most need of treatments, including fillings and root canal work, would be prioritised under proposals aimed at what Labour is calling rescuing NHS dentistry. The plans would be financed, the party says, by using £111 million a year from abolishing non-domiciled tax status. Sir Keir says Labour wants to target areas where people can't get a dental appointment.
Too many places across the country there's a desert where you can't get an NHS dentist, so we also have a scheme in place to ensure that we get newly qualified dentists into those areas. So that's the immediate fix, but obviously in the longer term we need to do preventative measures. So the third limb of this is toothbrushing at schools where we've got the biggest problems in our breakfast clubs, to make sure that children are brushing in the right way and therefore we prevent some of the problems.
In international news, at least 51 people have died after a Russian missile hit a cafe-cum-grocery store in northeastern Ukraine. It's reported the victims were holding a memorial service at the time. Ukrainian officials called it a heinous crime. The attack was the deadliest in Kiev since the start of the war. And the Prime Minister's met with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, saying Europe must face down the threat from Russia. Rishi Sunak is in Spain for the European Political Community Summit. The Prime Minister condemned today's attack and reiterated the UK's support for Ukraine in the ongoing war, adding the only person responsible for the conflict was President Putin.
Just come from meeting President Zelensky where we discussed this horrific attack that has just happened. It just illustrates Russia's barbarity, and President Putin could say all he likes. There is one person responsible for this illegal, unprovoked war, and it is him, and he should stop. And that's why the UK has been steadfast in supporting Ukraine and will continue to do so. I'm proud that we were one of the first and we are one of the largest supporters of Ukraine. That will continue to be the case.
Rishi Sunak speaking there. You're with GB News across the UK on TV, in your car on digital radio, and now on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. This is Britain's news channel.
The Prime Minister has had a busy few weeks reforming policies such as net zero, scrapping HS2 or pushing through North Sea gas and oil licences. But it seems there's even more method to these sensible measures than some may have thought. What is clear about these policies is that there are very few costs involved. Indeed, scrapping the northern leg of HS2 saves us £32 billion and, considering previous overruns, potentially much more. Pushing through North Sea gas and oil licences will raise billions for the Treasury, especially considering the 75% effective tax rate on domestic energy production. And the reforms to net zero policy will let you keep more of your own money. But it seems these aren't just good policies because they're cutting waste and being more frugal with your taxpayer money. They're good policies because we could be facing a financial shift across Western economies. The cost of government borrowing has been rocketing. The return on 30-year UK gilts has just reached a 20-year high. And this has real consequences on capital values. If I give you an example, if you bought the 2073 index-linked gilt when it was issued, it would have cost you £330. It's now worth £62. That's a fall of 80%. So if you need the cash now, if you can't wait until 2073, you've had a huge capital loss. And we're seeing similar things happening in other Western economies, such as the US and Germany. And what this means is that markets are cracking down on government borrowing. They're saying that they don't have confidence in these economies to pay back their debts, or particularly in real terms, because they're worried about inflation. And there is a good reason for this, because governments have been spending too freely. If you think that the two great costs to the taxpayer every year, the NHS at about 183 billion, and then welfare, 230 billion, next you might expect education or defence spending, but you'd be wrong. In the year to May, debt interest payments were £117 billion. That's the third highest bill after welfare and the NHS. It's more than £2 billion every week as a consequence of historic borrowing. If you think last year we borrowed £128 billion, we're effectively borrowing money to pay the interest on our historic borrowing. It begins to sound like a giant Ponzi scheme. And this is why the cost in borrowing is so important, because it's a signal that we can't afford to borrow more. In the past, in recent years, a combination of quantitative easing and low interest rates, and the two went hand in glove, have given governments across the globe nearly free money. But that's changing with this shift in gilt yields, global bond yields generally. So what does it mean? Well, basically, we will have to cut expenditure. And this is a problem because if the economy is slowing, the automatic stabilisers put up the cost of welfare, but we're going to find that we don't have the money for it. It begins to sound like a repeat of the late 1970s and early 1980s, and we may well need similarly tough reforms to recover from this. But of course, I want to hear from you. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts. You know the email off by heart by now, mailmog@gbnews.com. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be joined by Peter Schiff, the Chief Economist of Euro-Pacific Asset Management. Peter, thank you for joining me. How would you advise governments to deal with this?
Well, unfortunately, governments have to significantly reduce spending. The problem was they spent so much in the past and they borrowed the money to do it just because the central banks made borrowing so cheap. But
unfortunately, it's frozen. But fortunately, I've got somebody who's going to come to the rescue, because Vicky Price, the Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economic and Business Research, is here. Vicky, what would your solution be? How would you advise governments to deal with this?
Well, there are two things that the governments can do. First of all, they can grow slightly faster without necessarily generating inflation. That may look like a difficult thing to achieve right now. Nevertheless, inflation is falling, even in the US. So you mentioned the US and the interest rates there, the yields which have gone up quite significantly in there as well. And yet inflation is half of ours here in the UK. And the trends are downwards. Yes, we may have the odd month when things perhaps sort of tick up a little bit. But overall, what we're seeing is that energy prices are going down. Yes, OK, oil prices have come up a little bit recently, but overall, nothing compared to what we saw with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, when energy costs, of course, went up significantly. So if inflation indeed is perceived to be sorted over the next 12 months, there is no justification for having central bank interest rates as high as they are right now in many countries, frankly, also including in the UK. And second, what you can do is you can look at ways in which the economy can perhaps grow faster. Because if you do that, of course, it eases quite considerably what your debt burden, in fact, is. And the interesting thing is that the way in which you can get your debt-to-GDP ratio to come down is mostly through getting more output, more activity in the economy.
But isn't this the dilemma for governments, that they need to get economic growth, but higher interest rates make it harder to get economic growth? But if they don't have higher interest rates, they don't get inflation down. So you risk getting in to a vicious cycle that makes it really hard to break free.
No, you're quite right. But that, of course, assumes that inflation is still an issue. And, of course, it's high, but it is coming down. And we have to bear in mind that the very substantial increase in interest rates that we have seen over the last year and a half is coming through the system right now. And if we don't start reducing interest rates soon, what we'll see is that the economy actually slows down even further. So the government debt issue is going to be much greater.
Yeah, well, I absolutely agree with that, and wonder whether the Bank of England may have gone too far and not waited to see the consequences of the early interest rate increases. But that was the point I was making about the automatic stabilisers. You are likely to have, with the interest rate rises we've already had, a slowing economy, which is likely to push up the demands on welfare, which pressurises the government budget even more, and therefore it's harder to get growth in these circumstances.
No, I agree, but the very interesting thing about what's happening now, if we compare with where we were even pre-pandemic, is that in the whole of the Western world, if you look at the OECD, which is sort of richer countries club, unemployment is considerably lower now than it was even before the financial crisis. So we had this period of an increase in unemployment where, of course, welfare spending would be going up. And now unemployment is at almost record lows, which is good news, gives us a bit of hope in terms of not getting into that exact position that you're worried about.
Except it's also potentially an inflationary pressure, and how much of it is people voluntarily having taken themselves out of the labour force, therefore increasing this pressure on a tight labour market when you've got an inflationary problem.
That is true, and I think it is one of the reasons why the economies haven't really slumped as a result of the very substantial increase in oil prices, because basically people carried on working and they had savings and they were able to continue to spend. That isn't what caused the inflation, of course. The inflation was caused by external factors. Now, those external factors are disappearing. So what worries me, and the reason why the yields are so high right now, which is going back to the issue of government debt being so expensive right now, is because it is perceived by the bondholders or those who are playing in the market that actual inflation will still be high and interest rates will still be high in the economy, which is going to bring this slowdown in growth, is going to bring these problems with government debt. And that comes because the central banks keep saying we're going to keep interest rates at those high levels for longer than we thought originally. Why? If all the forecasts are showing quite clearly that we're getting to target on inflation 2%, really in the next 12 months.
Well, and the US has basically already achieved that. But isn't this another one of the most glorious dilemmas for governments? Actually, from a government's point of view, with a large stock of debt, one of the things that reduces it fastest, proportionate to GDP, is inflation.
Yes.
And so governments are tempted to talk about inflation being so damaging, but actually their debt position is improved by a bit of inflation.
Well, except that about a quarter of certainly our debt is index-linked, which therefore you don't get that benefit. And the other issue about how you reduce your debt because of inflation, it only holds if the inflation rate is higher than the interest rate you have to pay.
Yes.
But we're getting to the point now with the yields where they are, and pretty soon where that isn't going to be the case.
And that's really important, because what was interesting at the start of the rise of inflation and of interest rates is that the negative real interest rate was still huge, and it's only in the last few months that it's begun to narrow, which almost certainly has a bigger effect on economic activity than it did at the beginning.
Absolutely. And there is another element in terms of what's happening in the bond market, which is that you mentioned quantitative easing before. With quantitative tightening that's going on right now, many more bonds are finding their way into the market. So central banks are getting rid of everything that they have, well, slowly, that they have accumulated before. And of course, that's pushing bond prices even lower and pushing yields up. So the question is, do we want them to carry on doing so? Should they stop?
Well, that is a very important question, particularly as the Bank of England is selling at large losses rather than holding to maturity,
which have to
then
pay.
add to the stock of the national debt.
Well, absolutely, because the Treasury has guaranteed any losses, and it's the taxpayer.
Yeah. I've already exceeded time because I thought this was so interesting. Vicky, thank you very much indeed. Don't forget to let me know what you think, mailmog@gbnews.com. After the break, we'll be asking what the point of electing governments is when banks undermine democracy. Plus, I'll be doing a victory lap for Team Carnivore.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Join me, Andrew Pearce and Bev Turner, Monday to Thursday, 9:30 a.m.
Who benefits from that? Not the British public.
And on Fridays, join us, Tom Harwood
and Ellie Costello from Britain's Newsroom.
That's what you get with this show. That's fantastic.
If it's happening, we're talking about it on Britain's Newsroom.
GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Henry says, "Dear Jacob, you make such sense in explaining how government borrowing works. Just makes it terribly easy to understand, even for a layman like myself. I never understood the juxtapositions of borrowing by the government against spending and how gilt market works. Thank you." Well, no, thank you. I'm glad I was able to explain it. And Alistair says, "For decades, governments have printed money and called it quantitative easing, pretending it wouldn't be inflationary. We're now paying the price. Look after that cold." I don't think it was just one sneeze rather than cold, but you're kind anyway. The great revelation of the debanking scandal was the extent to which the sinister phenomenon of environmental, social and governance, ESG, has infiltrated many of our powerful, unelected institutions. Once again, it is the virtue-signalling green blob and the banks who are determining public policy, not you, the voter. Well, I'm afraid there's a new chapter in this story, and yes, you guessed it, it involves NatWest, whose largest shareholder is you. NatWest, under pressure from the regulators, has decided not to do what the Prime Minister announced a few weeks ago when he said the costly housing policy that would have mandated mortgage lenders ensure that properties on their loan books all had an energy performance rating of C or above, but not for NatWest, which, in line with Bank of England guidance issued a few years ago, decided to hold itself to this policy regardless, undermining the democratically elected PM. So this begs the question, what is the point of electing politicians when the institutions have other ideas? Well, I'm now joined by my panel, Associate Comment Editor of The Telegraph, Mutaz Ahmed, and the former Labour MP, Stephen Pound. Stephen, come on, the government makes an announcement and then it's overruled by a lefty bank.
Well, no, I don't know about lefty banks, but I think the problem is, Jacob, we can only really discuss this in the shadow of this horrific scandal, regarding your fellow broadcaster Nigel Farage, who pointed out quite rightly the other day that his bank still holds an account for Rose West, but apparently not for him, and you can't do it. Look, the reality is that the biggest growth in criminality in the 21st century is fraud, and banking fraud is very, very common. Therefore, we now have all these rules and regulations about money laundering. So there has to be an extent of that. But the thing that you're talking about heat pumps and things like that, I mean, I have to say, I find it difficult to get my head around that. I can appreciate that if the bank is lending the money, there's no law that says thou shalt lend the money to the individual. So the bank, to a certain extent, in this free market capitalist world in which we live, in which you luxuriate and I despise, this does it. So they do have that option. But I think, frankly, what this is really about is, I think you touched on it in your monologue. This is really and truly, this is virtue signalling. Everybody is so desperate to avoid giving offence that what is, in many ways, a perfectly reasonable thing. If I lend money to you, I'd actually check you out first. In fact, obviously, your credibility and your credit is excellent. But, you need to actually do these things. But I would never say, I'm going to lend you a few bob on the condition that you stick a solar panel on your roof and a couple of wind farms on your second downstairs paddock.
It was the Telegraph that broke this story, and it's fun to have a pop at the NatWest because of what they did to Nigel. But actually, the Bank of England issued a circular a few years ago not wanting people to lend to fossil fuel companies and worried about orphan assets. And it just flows from that, doesn't it? And the FCA is in the same boat. It's regulation-driven.
Exactly. We need to find out exactly what the FCA regulation is, because often politicians say one thing, and as you might know, it's not really acted upon. So
Good heavens.
You end up with a policy statement that says one thing and a regulation that says another. So we've got to find that out. But it's also, this stuff has become so embedded that businesses think it's non-partisan, and they're so obsessed with being good that they don't realise that their definition of good is ideological. And so they've taken in all these ESG regulations, they've embedded it into their own regulations to such an extent that a government statement cannot change it. You see it with the environmental stuff. You also see it with, frankly, diversity quotas. You see it with retainment policies, which have become a form of implementing wokeness. And they become so distracted by this, but they're no longer driven, some companies, by profit.
But ESG, therefore, is a failure in fiduciary duty, isn't it? Because the job of NatWest is to make money for its shareholders, not to tell people what type of house they should live in.
Exactly, but that definition has been changed. The job of NatWest is to be a good company, and it considers being a good company to be the most profitable thing, when, even if that isn't true, and being a good company means, having its own net zero target. NatWest has its own net zero targets. BP had a net zero target. or he was trying to develop net zero by 2050, for which for an oil company is very strange. So you end up with good governance, and being a good company, meaning being an ideological company that imposes wokery.
Stephen, this is the success of Tony Blair, isn't it? Your great friend, that he managed to develop the regulatory state, and the regulations carry on even when you change government, and that it was a remarkable success of New Labour to embed their underlying ideological view of the world in companies through things like ESG and through the FCA, the regulatory state, with all the quangocrats involved.
I don't actually agree with that, I'm sorry to say. Corporate social responsibility was first adumbrated back in the 1890s by Jamsetji Tata, whose great-grandson we all know, particularly in your part of the world. And corporate social responsibility, which is actually the father or the godfather of what we're talking about today, is entirely excellent. I think it's very sensible. I understand your fiduciary duty. In pure capitalism, you're there to make money for your shareholders, but you also, you're a fish swimming in the ocean of wider society. And I think for banks to actually recognise that they have a wider societal duty is a good thing. Unfortunately, they may be taking it too far.
Well, exactly. How is it good for renters? How is it good for young renters to force them to pay an extra £10,000 to upgrade their homes?
Well, as long as the government says you've got to do it.
When they can barely afford their rent.
Yeah, but you're shooting at the wrong target there, aren't you? You really should be shooting at the government.
Well, the government's now saying you no longer have to.
Well, yeah, but that was this week. I mean, who knows what's next week?
But somebody's always got to pay for it. So you have these nice ideas and you say, well, we must get to level C on the energy ratings. But it's either paid for the taxpayer or it's paid for by the individual. In either way, this is a non-productive use of money.
But Jacob, this was always the case. That, I mean, back in the dawn of time, when I had my first mortgage, they said, how much do you earn? I was a porter at the Middlesex Hospital. Said, how much overtime do you earn? What sort of home do you have? And they actually rate you and grade you. It's not just computer says no. You have to actually provide certain information about that. And in the long term, I would have thought that if the law of the land is that you've got to get rid of your gas boiler, then a bank is not going to say to you, I'll lend it to you without considering whether you've got a gas boiler or not. But the fact that the gas boiler is wrong, that legislation is for the birds. It's neither here nor there.
But this is going to cause a real problem in the housing market, because you will have unsaleable houses that, if you can't get a mortgage on them, the value of the property declines dramatically because it can only be bought by cash buyers.
Exactly. And as if the housing market isn't already in crisis. This is another way in which people find out the true cost of net zero. We saw it with ULEZ, we're seeing it now with housing. And the justification for this is not, there's a profit motive. The justification is these companies think they're doing good things for the planet by stopping renters from, by forcing renters or their landlords to upgrade their homes and stopping people from remortgaging their homes or from selling their homes. That's not good for people. It's not.
I don't think it's quite as popular.
We're going to have to move on, unfortunately, but thank you to my panel. And there's other green news. Our friends at Just Stop Oil have engaged in their latest act of civil disobedience after invading the stage of Les Miserables in London's West End. Now, I may have some issues with the French, but frankly, I think this is a rather miserable step. I'm joined now by Just Stop Oil representative Chloe Noldret. Chloe, thank you so much for joining me. Isn't it really nasty to ruin people's evening, people who've saved up to buy a ticket to go there for their birthday or a wedding anniversary, and some hooligans go in and disrupt the programme?
Thanks for having me on, Jacob. That's an interesting question. I'd just like to start by saying the big news of today, the big climate news of today, is that the scientists have run out of words to describe what is happening in respect of global annual average temperatures. We've just had the hottest global September on record. That follows the hottest July on record and the hottest August on record. So the situation that we're in, the scientists have got their heads in their hands.
But this isn't what I asked you about. I asked you whether it's deeply selfish and unpleasant to ruin people's harmless pleasure, which they've spent good money on. Are you going to compensate the people who were there?
What I'll say, Jacob, is that aside from being the parent of two young children, I also have a 20-year career in theatre. I'm a theatre professional. So I absolutely understand not only the frustration of the audience last night, but also the anxiety and the stress that was almost certainly caused to the performers on stage and the technical team working backstage. But what the cultural industries exist to do, and what artists exist to do.
So are you actually condemning the protesters last night? Now you've said that, you feel sorry for the performers, sorry for the audience, sorry for the backstage hands?
Now, I can hold two thoughts in my head at the same time, Jacob. I appreciate the disruption caused.
So this is crocodile tears, isn't it? You had somebody on crying on Sky News, another set of crocodile tears.
But what I will say is that we exist in the cultural industries and as artists to reflect society back at itself. And Les Miserables wasn't chosen by accident. Les Miserables is a story that starts off with a man being imprisoned for stealing a loaf of bread to feed a starving child. A woman is forced to sell her hair, then her teeth, and then her body to feed her child. And then at the exact moment that they disrupted the story last night, we have a revolution, an uprising of students against
but we've now got a democracy, which they didn't have in France at that time. Why don't you stand for election?
I haven't got time to stand for election, Jacob. We've got to work.
Well, you're too important to stand for election and put your name in front of voters.
Also, one of the most fantastic MPs we've had over recent years, who's done more for the climate than anyone else, Caroline Lucas, is stepping down from Parliament because she says she cannot achieve what she needs to do.
But that's because the Greens can't win an election, isn't it? That people only vote for one Green MP. So, are you against democracy? Should we have a totalitarian state run by Just Stop Oil? Is that what you want?
I'm not against democracy. What I'm against
is stand for election then, because instead you just bully people.
Again, this government, which has no mandate because its leader was not chosen by the people, has announced 100.
It's got a majority in Parliament, which is how a constitution works.
In the North Sea. That announcement of new licences is against not just the advice but the warnings of the United Nations, the World Health Organization, every single climate scientist.
But that announcement of licences actually reduces emissions, doesn't it? It will reduce emissions because they're lower if we use our own resources than import them.
If we burn fossil fuels, it will increase emissions.
But we're going to burn the same number of fossil fuels anyway. It's just ours rather than being imported.
It's not coming from me, Jacob. That's coming from experts.
But the experts acknowledge that it will reduce the emissions because it doesn't have the transportation emissions.
So we are being governed by a government that is not acting in the best interests of its people. And
we'll stand for election and see if people agree with you, rather than rioting.
I completely understand and support these young people who stepped up last night to say, as in the words that we hear in that show, it's time to decide who we are. Are we going to stand?
Thank you very much to Clay Neldret, the Just Stop Oil spokesman, for joining me this evening. I'll go back to my panel. Come on, Stephen, you're a socialist.
Of course,
but you're a Democrat as well, aren't you?
Socialist. I believe in democratic socialism. I don't believe in revolution. I don't believe in narcissism. I don't believe in standing. And just because you can afford to live on the top of the hill, you occupy the moral high ground. As far as I'm concerned, I think some of the JSO people are actually, secret agents of big oil, because I've never known any group of people do more to denigrate a perfectly good cause than them with their particular actions at the present time.
And isn't this right, Mutaz, that they undermine their own case? And this, I can never get this refusal to stand for Parliament. They don't think anyone will vote for them, do they?
Well, exactly. They also think they're above the law. They think the law shouldn't apply to them as it applies to everyone else, because, frankly, they are arrogant and they think they're better than everyone else.
Well, I thought that wonderful line. She was too busy to stand for Parliament. She didn't have time to stand for Parliament.
I also rather like the idea of holding two thoughts in your head at the same time, which is a marvellous excuse for the sort of philosophical duality that you come up with.
Well, it's great defence of hypocrisy, isn't it?
It's such a pious, quote, pious cause. They can do no wrong. Everyone else is wrong. They can do whatever they like. It's pathetic. But
it's also, it's just so mean, because lots of people go to a show in the West End. They're very expensive, these shows.
£150 minimum price for
a couple go, that's £300 you're talking about, and their evening's ruined. And I don't know whether the theatre can afford to give them new tickets for another occasion, but even so, if you've gone for a particular birthday, that particular birthday never happens again. It's just such a nasty thing to...
So are you going to come blinking into the twilight of Covent Garden and say, do you know, I'm now convinced, I'm now entirely supporting their cause? Of course, it's entirely the opposite.
Many people in that audience will have been sympathetic.
Not anymore.
They will have been sympathetic, and they've turned them against them.
Well, and you'd have guessed the cast would have been... I mean, this is very unfair generalisation, but a lot of people in the arts world are not particularly high Tories. Yeah. And you'd have thought they would be, as you say, quite sympathetic, and you would expect they've been rather put off now.
Yeah.
Well, I remember, I mean, I think before either of you two were born, when I used to go on the C&D marches, 1959, 1960, and we had people like Pat Arrowsmith and people like Peggy Duff, and they used to absolutely say, whatever you do, you must not hold up the traffic, you must walk on this side of the road, they'll be properly marshalled. And this was CND. I said, don't chuck him out because, he's strayed into the middle of the road. And I think you've got to actually be a bit grown up about this. And you've got to look and just say, is this, what are we actually achieving by doing this? We're achieving a glorious sense of self-satisfaction. We're glowing like that breakfast cereal where the kids come glow. This absolute feeling.
Ready brag.
Yeah,
Yes.
Well, that's what they're just glowing with, narcissism and self-belief. And it's embarrassing, man. It's embarrassing.
Well, thank you very much to my panel. After messages from our sponsors, is it yet another chapter of the nanny state as GPs are set to begin screening gambling addictions? Plus, my penchant for meat might have ancient origins in God's own county.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Andrew Pearce and Bev Turner, Monday to Thursday, 9:30 a.m.
Who benefits from that? Not the British public.
And on Fridays, join us, Tom Harwood
and Ellie Costello from Britain's Newsroom.
That's what you get with this show. That's fantastic.
If it's happening, we're talking about it on Britain's Newsroom.
GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Steve says, what's the point of electing politicians when they don't do what they're elected for? The banks are just following suit. And Mark says, Jacob, you've got to realise that the person you're interviewing is a zealot and a product of your own party's net zero policies, which fortunately seem to be changing. While I have no doubt revelled in many of the recent decisions from the Prime Minister, the one debatable announcement from his speech yesterday was his intention to ban the next generation from ever being able to buy cigarettes. More news emerged today that GPs are set to begin screening patients for gambling addiction as well as for their smoking and drinking habits. And while it could be argued that there's a duty of care from our doctors to assess patients' mental health and addictive proclivities, is this a step too far? Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by my panel, associate commentator at the Daily Express, Mutaz Ahmed, and the Transcaucasia expert and former Labour MP, Stephen Pound. Mutaz, I'm broadly in favour of people being able to make choices for themselves, except, oddly, when it comes to gambling. And the reason for that is I've had constituents come to me with such serious gambling problems that I feel that we've got laws that exist that protect them, and I wouldn't want to see those protections watered down. Have I sold out?
I think gambling is a unique case. There's a question. There are people calling for bans on gambling, which would be wrong because some people do it for enjoyment, and you should allow some people to risk some of their own capital. But there are people who develop addictions, and in that case, they require specialist treatment. There is a risk, though, that when you impose blanket regulations, you catch out those who don't need help, who gamble for fun, and who just want some freedom in their life to risk whatever they want to risk. Whatever small amount of money, disposable income they wish to risk, they should be allowed to do so.
I admired Mrs Thatcher for very few things, but two things I did admire her for. One was for her passion for Europe, which I have to say resonated with me, and the other was her refusal to have the national lottery, you know, coming from that sort of Methodist background. And I still remember going to see a family in my old constituency one Monday morning, and I noticed that the woman was putting water on the children's cornflakes because they couldn't afford the milk because she'd actually bought these lottery tickets the day before, or the Saturday before. Now, look, I think this goes back, there's a huge debate in this country. You look at the Times back in the 1850s and 1860s, after John Snow discovered the cholera thing. They had a headline, "We will not be bullied into health." And the idea is that if you take away the free choice, you know, it somehow diminishes the individuality of the human being. I would say we have to have crash helmets, we have to wear seat belts, we don't have lead in petrol. There's a whole range of things which has gone with the grain of the nation. And I think people now recognise that it's actually it's in the good of the nation. This cigarette smoking thing, firstly, cigarette smoking has been declining dramatically since the Black Report, which is what, in the late 70s. Secondly, Jacob, I mean, you've got a marvellous imagination. Can you imagine the situation in a few years' time where a 59-year-old man cannot buy cigarettes, but a 60-year-old man can, and therefore you're going to be asked to produce... Can you prove that you're 59 years old? I'm sorry. You know, it's declining anyway. Let's go with the warp and weft of the nation, not try to force it. But I have to say, I do rather like the idea of a nanny state. If nannies are good enough for some of the people I admire greatly, are they good enough for me? And I think if I can't afford one, let's see the nation provide one.
This is the problem with prohibition, right? Which is that it's addictive. Regulation is addictive. You end up prohibiting things that don't need prohibition. As you said, cigarette smoking is going... ironically, it's the youngest who stigmatise it the most because it stinks and it's not cool. Vaping is a bigger problem.
Absolutely.
I'm very worried about a Conservative government getting too used to imposing regulations and banning things because it spreads. It spreads.
Yes, but the Prime Minister's point that no parent wants his or her children to smoke is a pretty good one, isn't it? And this idea that therefore you just have a cut-off point and nobody who's ever been allowed to smoke will be banned, but no new smokers will be created. Isn't that at least a good argument?
Society isn't that clean, and it's not that straightforward. I know the Prime Minister's he's a fan of maths and equations, but that's not how the world works. You will end up with underground smoking. Why would you want to give gangs another product to sell?
Well, that's the other side of it, that if you look at prohibition in the US, prohibiting something that has been legal is much, much harder than drugs laws, which aren't particularly successful anyway, banning something that's never been legal. And that seems to me to be one of the risks with this policy, is that in 10 or 20 years' time, you will have a huge black market in cigarettes, and you have an incentive to push cigarettes to younger people again, which you currently don't have.
It's also much more sustainable and much more effective to let something go out of fashion, right? Do you see people walking around with snuff? No. Do kids...
We must bring it back.
You could bring it back. But it's a more sustainable thing. If the kids are not smoking cigarettes, right, we're down to about 5% who are trying out cigarettes.
But I remember Oscar Wilde's great line, he said, as long as war is thought to be wicked, it will always have its supporters. It's only when it's perceived as vulgar that people will support it. But look, I'm sorry, I think that this does create a whole range of problems that we haven't actually grasped. And I think your point about governments being addicted to this is a very, very important point. Because where does the prohibition stop? And your point about, the Volstead Act, I mean, there was no mafia, no Cosa Nostra, anything like that, until the
after you banned something something.
But when we had in my football club, we actually had a sweep back in the day where everybody smoked. They swept up all the cigarette packets, and they found that even then, 15 years ago, 80% of the tobacco that we were smoking was smuggled in mostly from Holland.
Well, thank you very much to my panel. I said Mutaz was from the Express, but I'm extraordinary.
Telegraph, I hope.
I managed that. He's from the Telegraph and occasionally asks me to write for him, so I really ought to know. But coming up, did you know that my fellow Somersetarians used to be cannibals?
Some still are, I believe.
Join me, Andrew Pearce and Bev Turner, Monday to Thursday, 9:30am.
Who benefits from that? Not the British public.
And on Fridays, join us, Tom Harwood
and Ellie Costello from Britain's Newsroom.
That's what you get with this show. That's fantastic.
If it's happening, we're talking about it on Britain's Newsroom.
GB News, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7pm.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11pm for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11pm every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11am on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute? Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6pm, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Mick says, I fail to understand why people like those in the audience at the Les Miserables show do not sue Just Stop Oil for damages. And Ben says, oh, Ben, no. God's own county is and always has been Yorkshire. Everyone knows God spent 5.5 days in Yorkshire and it always rains in Somerset. Well, having just come back from Manchester, I think Manchester gives us a run for our money. But it's why the fields are so green and the cows are so happy and the milk is so good. Anyway, I'm not particularly partial to vegetables, though the runner beans I've always rather liked, not those watery and chewy French beans, and a bit of Popeye-style spinach, but I've never been the greatest fan. However, a new study has exonerated me from all the folate cheerleaders. Scientists have found that some people, and I'm sure I'm one of them, have a genetic predisposition to crave the fats found in meats and dairy, while some are able to produce the nutrients found in these fats without actually eating them. Now, I think I can date my carnivorous proclivities back to about 13,000 BC, where scientists have found that my possible ancestors living in Cheddar Gorge in God's own county, thank you very much, Ben, had cannibalistic tendencies. Scientists say They essentially ate their dead instead of burying them to stock up on protein and reduce waste, an early form of recycling. Interestingly, I listened to an excellent audiobook by Dr. Alice Roberts called Ancestors, which noted that the analysis of human bones indicated a higher proportion of meat in their diets than those of the bones of wolves nearby, and she also discussed the cannibalism issue. Well, with me now to chew over the facts is chef and broadcaster Tonya Buxton. Tonya, thank you for coming in. This is good news for carnivores, isn't it? That we're naturally meat eaters, and so we should jolly well carry on.
Well, to a certain extent. I think the thing that we really need to understand is that we do have to have a mixed diet, and it should be regional, and it should be seasonal and regional. That's what our body craves. This whole fad and fashion to become vegans, I don't think is right for us. Years of eating have proved that we do need meat, and you cannot become a vegan. You can't be a vegan without subsidising your diet. So you are right, but it depends on how much you're eating, what you're eating, and where the meat comes from. So, you know, if you're buying organic meat that's reared in a beautiful, humane way, then that's going to be really good for you. If you're going to eat battery-fed, battery-charged chickens and battery-produced meat, that's not going to be quite so good for you. So there is a difference in what you're eating. OK, but one of the things I'm actually always concerned about is ensuring that people have access to cheap food and that we are free to import good quality food from around the world. This hugely upsets the Minette Batters of the National Farmers Union when I said this at the Tory Party conference. But we should be open to the world, shouldn't we? We should get good quality produce globally, because we need to keep prices down for people who can't necessarily afford hand-reared beef. Yes, but the point is you don't need to have big slabs of meat with every meal. So if you... You're sure? You don't. I know that's what you do. To have? It is the Mediterranean diet, specifically the Greek Cretan diet, is the type of diet that really does prove longevity. But you have to go with your genes. For example, you know, a lot of African people are lactose intolerant, so they can't have milk. A lot of Asian people can't deal with alcohol because of evolution. So you have to kind of look at what your genes are and then take from your genes and then be regional and seasonal. The problem with a lot of these kind of vegans, vegetarians, is that they have way too much vegetables. It's actually making them unwell. And that's why they're not getting the right vitamins, the right minerals. You can't get B12 if you're a vegan. There are so many things you can't get. But eating big slabs of meat 3 times a day, again, especially if it's meat that's been processed, is very bad for you. OK, 3 times a day would be heavy going, but twice a day wouldn't be so bad, would it? You don't need lunch and dinner. Listen, you don't need it, and I completely agree with you that you have to have affordable meats, but you want those meats not to be full of hormones. Talking of affordable meat, would you encourage people to eat offal? Because I thoroughly enjoy kidneys and liver, which I think are both delicious and, I understand, very nutritious. And yet, actually, we export an awful lot of our offal because the British aren't so keen on it. I think it's fashion, isn't it? It's a fad and it's a fashion. Steak and kidney pies were really popular when I was a kid. I love steak and kidney pie. Exactly. I love them too. So I think it's a case of just re-educating people because offal is so good for you. You know, in ritualistic ancient times, when they used to kill an animal, yes, the kings would get the offal. They would get the bits that were, you know, full of nutrients, and first, before the rest of the animal. But this was very difficult for the Emperor Claudius because he had a stammer, and when he was carrying out his ritual slaughter of a bull, if you stuttered, you had to start again and get a new bull. Oh, so he would be 3/4 of the way through a 2-hour ceremony and stutter, and they all had to start again. So you're absolutely right. There's a lot of slaughter there, then. And cannibalism, we don't want to go that far, do we? We don't want to go that far, no, we don't want to go that far, though I like the way that you traced your genealogies right back to the cannibals. I do think that people need to have a really good look at their diet, and I understand why a lot of people cannot become vegetarians because their body craves meat so much, and that's why they end up breaking the dairy. And that now people tell us that butter's much better for you than margarine. It's much nicer. Whoever thought it wasn't? And margarine's disgusting. It's absolutely plastic food. Why would you want to eat plastic food? Well, butter is delicious. Butter is the only reason to eat bread, isn't it? Because it allows you to put a lot of butter on. Well, you're making me hungry, Jacob. Excellent. Good. We're heading towards dinner time. But one of the things that's quite interesting is that butter and eggs, if they're reared organically or reared in an open way, they have K12 present in them, which is something that we really need. But if they're reared in a battery farm way, or if they're reared with hormones, they don't have K12 present. So it's quite important that, yes, we get reasonable price food, but it's got to be reared properly and not be filled full of hormones. So we've got to be careful what we import and export.
And seasonal food. I think you'll say right there, because one of the great joys of an English summer, and I'm sorry this is a vegetable, is asparagus. When that appears early on in the summer, it is one of the most delicious things to eat.
It is, and actually, you can grow whatever you like now in Britain. It's amazing. I mean, I had an abundance of tomatoes, which traditionally wouldn't grow very well in Britain, but you can grow whatever you like now. But you have gluts of things. And then in the winter, you don't have quite as much. Spinach, as you were saying before.
I quite like spinach.
But you don't need to have a lot of it, because it's got a lot of octates in it, which can be poisonous to you. So these people that have these juices that are dense, concentrated juices, well, that's not really good for you.
I'd rather have beef tea. But this year was the first year I managed to grow my own asparagus in any quantities, so I'm very proud of that.
Well done.
Thank you so much for coming on. That's all from me for this week. Up next, it's Patrick Christie's. Patrick, what is on your bill of fare this evening? I hope you've got some meat.
I am so hungry now after that. Thank you very much. Great show. Well, we've got it all this evening. We've got Alison Pearson, we've got Sean Bailey, we've got Amy Nicole. We're talking about Britain not being a hate-filled little racist cesspot. The hate crime figures are in. Shock horror. We're a lovely nation. I'm also going to be talking about Kevin Keegan's comments as well. Do female pundits at male football matches bother you? Stay tuned.
Well, that sounds extremely interesting. And a reminder that the English are best. That's coming up after the weather. I'll be back at Monday at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and I shall be now driving down to God's Own County, where I am certain that the weather will be absolutely splendiferous, and I bet it's raining in Yorkshire. Ha!
Hello again, it's Aidan McGivern here from the Met Office for the GB News forecast. Fine in the far south over the next 24 hours. A different story elsewhere. There will be cloud. There'll be outbreaks of rain as well. Not everywhere all the time, but some significant rain could build up in places by the weekend. Low pressure at the moment to the northwest of Scotland. A number of trailing weather fronts bringing a lot of cloud to the UK for the rest of Thursday and into Friday. Those outbreaks of rain continuing over parts of Wales into the Midlands, Northern England, Northern Ireland, southern Scotland. Initial band of rain clearing from the far north of Scotland, pushed away by a strong wind. And it's going to be a warm night everywhere with that wind and the cloud. Temperatures in many places not falling much below 15 degrees. Then we start off Friday with those cloudy conditions, the breezy conditions as well. Plenty of brightness, actually, for central and northern Scotland. A much better day compared with Thursday and certainly Saturday. But for much of Northern Ireland into southern Scotland later, as well as northern England, rain will persist through the day. It's to the south where we're going to see the warmth building, and increasingly high temperatures through the weekend are expected. But for Scotland, certainly it's going to be a wet start to the weekend. That rain really building up through Saturday and the first part of Sunday. Western parts of Scotland at risk of seeing 150 millimetres of rainfall. A very different story for the rest of the UK, and certainly across the southern half of England and Wales, we'll see temperatures into the...
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute? Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play